So why don't we start by
Mhm.
talking about like what got us together around the research? Like what was your initial
Food,
food?
Jason,
Yes.
food. You know, always brings me together with people.
Yeah.
And I was speaking to an art historian from New York 2 days ago, and she said, "What are you doing right now?" And I told her a little bit about this, and she said, "That sounds like a fabulous project." And that her partner was looking at doing a documentary series
Oh, wow.
on foods from around the world.
Oh my
And
gosh.
so I said, well, keep us in mind if that
Yeah.
happens. And she said, it all depends on funding. So
Yeah.
we're back to the same old, same old. But it was really food, and I had been looking at vinegar and how cooking and the preservation of food changed in Goa when the Portuguese brought in vinegar, and how that transformed certain meats that could be eaten.
And specifically fish, right? Isn't it?
Well, no, it was pork as well.
Oh, right.
And because it was kept preserved for such a long time, I think they felt, and I haven't found the scientific justification for this, but that it was not a diseased meat, because that was the underlying fear of eating pork.
Right.
That it would spoil very quickly
Sure.
in hot weather, which is why, of course, as we know, the Jews and the Muslims don't eat it.
Yep.
But so it was mainly for that, and then for fish, it became a way that allowed society in Goa to be able to consume fish in the monsoons, which was never done until it could be preserved.
I see. Of course, the other method that the Chinese do is salting fish, which would then help the fish here last.
We do that in Goa as well, but then it's dried and salted. And preserving it in vinegar gives it a different taste
profile
and texture. Whereas the salted dried fish,
it doesn't retain that mouthfeel.
No, it doesn't have the fish texture.
Yeah, definitely.
So it was all about that, and then through that I got really interested in João de Loureiro, who was a Portuguese priest but also a botanist of some note, and he came around the same time as Vasco da Gama on his voyages, and he was fascinated with all the different types of spice leaves and how they were used in Southeast Asia, and mainly Southeast Asia from what I can see. And one of the leaves that he looks at is laksa leaf. So it all kind of trickled in together.
And then I was also coming in early on with the fascination with the Chinese lorry, where they had preserved the fish at the ports in order to reuse the disposed and very cheap shark meats that would have then entered this really ugly looking dish. But with a very strong vinegar profile, which nowadays has become kind of optional.
And again, do you think that is because I've been looking at all those recipes as well? Is that because it was caught very early in the morning? By the time people ate it, it was much later in the day, and so the vinegar kind of
that could
prevented it from spoiling.
I've also been told it's because that the shark meat raw when you cook it without the vinegar, it has a very strong fishy kind of smell to it. I've never actually cooked shark.
In fact, it has. In Goa, for instance, they substitute it for meat because it's cheaper than meat, and it has the same chunky quality, and you can tell people it's chicken because it has that white meat texture and taste, and it does not smell fishy. Particularly because it doesn't smell fishy. Okay. So it's but it has to be cooked fresh, and that's why I come back to vinegar, because it's caught very early because they're deep sea fish. So they're caught at 2 and 3 in the morning, and by the time they come ashore, it's 4:30 or 5, and then by the time someone gets it, it's already several hours after it's caught. So maybe the fishy smell begins to increase.
I see. Okay. Yeah, I also was looking at, and I think this is in part because we were both growing kali leaves at the time.
Yeah.
And so we came upon really investigating laksa, right, and the different varieties of laksa. especially I would think right at this moment, 3 specific varieties: the Assam laksa,
Yeah.
and where the etymology of Assam might have help us understand how the current dish in the recipe came about as something that is not quite um, completely specific to Malaya. It seems to have been
So just looking at all the
further up the
food
peninsula as well,
things
yeah.
from South Asia through to Southeast to China, in fact, the earlier texts on food all specify that for a meal to be satisfying
Right.
and for a person to feel satiated, the meal should or the dish should touch hot, sweet, sour.
Right. This is also the only laksa, right, that
Yeah.
has that kind of profile.
Yeah.
The other two we were looking at, the Peranakan one and the laksa lemak, doesn't quite have that
No.
sourness. Yeah.
So I just wonder whether it was sort of came about as in it was invented to satiate people with very meager protein in it.
Mm. And of course, the other curiosity I had was whether or not it was because it was developed further up in the peninsula as well. But there are Penang Assam laksa. So my curiosity was whether or not it had something to do with Siam, right? Where some of that sour flavor profiles might have kind of seeped into the dish, into the recipe.
But doesn't, I mean, even Penang fish curry has Assam in it. So there is a tendency to cook with tamarind in that region. Is it only that region? Because I have not looked further afield. Or is it all Malaysia?
Yeah, I would be interested to find out if on the other side of that peninsula, in like Kedah, whether or not it's still that way, and then further up into like Patani, whether it's also that way.
And because these are not necessarily, at least I couldn't find early records of tamarind trees growing. So it's possible that the Portuguese did bring tamarind to this part of the world as well.
Yeah, and you had a suspicion that the Portuguese had contributed a couple of things to our thinking around what's Malaysian food or Singapore food.
I'm not sure about Singapore food because that notion I think comes a bit later, but definitely Malaysian. I do. I mean, I'm constantly kind of flitting in and out of that how much the Portuguese brought in and how much they, from recent reading, how much they had to discard their cargo because of bad weather, and that cargo became part of local culture. And then and started a demand for that very cargo that they discarded, so that local people began to kind of ask for more of it. And one of the things is teli cherry pepper. So the black pepper that they would bring from Kerala.
Right.
And they had to dump a few times in this area. And then people kind of began to cook with it and really liked the sharpness of the teli cherry pepper, and began to have a demand for the thing that was sort of thrown at them. So I'm kind of wondering about that, and of course chilies, which the Portuguese are known for bringing. But then I look at 5th century Ajanta painting, and there is a chili plant in there. So I was reading João de Loureiro and figured how much crossbreeding the Portuguese did with varieties that they brought in from Brazil and Mozambique and Angola into this part of the world, and they crossbred it with local chilies and local things, so that what we have now and what we recognize as local chilies is actually a crossbred, hardier version of an original. Right. So
that's also possible. Yeah, and also where did you find the historical record for the dumping? Was it in a diary, or was it in
a record in the stories of the voyages of Vasco da Gama.
I see. Oh, good.
So it just sort of, these things are pop up as odd sentences, and you think, my God, but that has an enormous effect on the way people then think about what they're eating, what they're producing, and what something from outside can, how it can change it to be something else.
Yeah.
So, it was such a throwaway line. And as I said, my aunt has been translating the Portuguese part of it, and in the conversation this came up.
Yeah.
And so just last Friday, and so we've started looking at how that begins to affect local needs and desires, and it happened later in the centuries as well with tea and other things. But
we were looking at the mercantile record for curry. Yeah, and I'm trying to widen that now with your suggestion to look at the record in Kerala.
And then Chinese papers you were going to look at.
And then further east towards the Chinese papers here and in Hong Kong. I was looking early on, and it's remarkable how early the Chinese records are. So I spent some time looking at the records of the Chinese demand for the trade in laksa leaves. Even though the laksa leaves were shipped and marketed with a colonial English label, so this will be in the 1920s. But it's clear from the advertising that they're really pitching and selling to.
And do you know which part of China used those leaves?
Here, like the ads I found here, and I suspect that the equivalent marketing could be used elsewhere, where you have an English label, something and co from London. But the size of the package is meant for domestic consumption. It's not meant for trade.
Is the laksa leaf used in any other?
So I suspect that it must have already been used by some dish already by the 1920s. If not laksa, it would have been something else.
But you found something fairly early for laksa too, before 1920. Didn't you find a recipe or a mention of it?
I found recipes, but they were in the I didn't find a recipe, but I found
in the newspaper. You found something.
Newspaper for a menu at the KFC restaurant.
Right. So if it's already in a restaurant as a menu, then it must have existed before that as well. So.
But what was interesting to me was it clearly entered a menu that was kind of like introducing the local palate to an English-speaking. I'm sensing a mixed crowd, right, where you would have the colonial expatriate community patronizing the restaurant, as well as the more the English-speaking, perhaps more educated. But then, what was fascinating to me was just understanding that maybe in the non-English-speaking world at the time, there was also this demand for the laksa leaf, so it must be evidently used in.
And in Zerwis, in the Chinese Cultural Center, I mean, laksa is a huge, it's a very important dish. Right? So it's hugely important for the Chinese population that was here anyway.
And you had this idea that the laksa, like a dish, is meant to be as rich and as nourishing
as possible, so that it satiating more than nourishing. Yeah. Because if you are considering, even the early recipe that you found had herrings and cheaper fish, or abundant
horse herring, which was
abundant fish but cheaper fish.
Yep.
And I just think that the idea of putting in all these spices and coconut milk and the tamarind gives you all the flavors you need to feel satiated. So you've got sweet, sour, and spicy, and everything. And all the way from South Asia to China, people have been writing from time immemorial that a proper meal has to satisfy all of those senses. So I'm sure that it was a way to make less expensive protein palatable.
I think there's something to that, the idea of like sating an appetite so that you feel full enough for at least half the day. Yeah, so I want to ask you, did laksa ever make the leap to fine dining, or is it always a hawker center? So I think the KFC restaurant was my first instance.
Oh, was a fine dining place?
Because I don't know if it's fine dining, but it's definitely a kind of cafe bistro setup, as opposed to you know, when you walk in through the doors of something that is comfortable, as opposed to like even a kopitiam or or something. But it's definitely not a street side establishment. Yeah, because this was in the YWCA.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
YMCA.
YMCA. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah.
YMCA.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So which
Okay.
again makes me think of that this is very likely a mixed crowd. Yeah.
So mixed as in Chinese, Malay, Indians, and
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
And so this was a way of this was a crossover dish. You feel that it could cross cultures and boundaries and.
Yeah. And it must have been an attraction for them to list it in part of the ad.
Yeah. I know, it's just kind of. So how do you want this to move on and to progress, and what can we, how?
I think one of the things I would like to do with you actually is to we mentioned this before too, is actually to try cooking a dish.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then to see and to taste for ourselves the different varieties of laksa. We found this book just saying, which lists at least 24 different kinds of laksas.
They're quite a number, and some have the souring agent in it, and a lot of them don't.
Yeah.
And the Thai laksa recipe is predominantly fish. The Singapore laksa recipe has chicken and tofu and fish. So there's obviously been over the years more enriching proteins put into this.
Yeah.
And it's and
it's also trying to explore. I mean, it's also here in the book when certain ideas of the lemak gets identified with something specifically with one kind of ethnicity as opposed to the other, right?
And what is that part of
and then
independent Singapore kind of forming its own identity and bringing?
I don't know yet. That's a good question.
It's constituent nationals together under one thing. Like the lo hei was a Singaporean invention, wasn't it?
Yep.
So
it was invented in a restaurant by a Chinese chef. Yeah.
So is this form of laksa where you put in many more ingredients than the other forms of laksa? Is this also a way of bringing together the constituent nationalities to make it Singaporean?
Yeah, and I don't know if it's also a deliberate attempt to make something Singaporean or Chinese. As I'm curious whether or not there might have been an idea of a laksa that was then subsequently adapted in very different ways. And part of me trying to trace the history is to see if the earliest examples of a laksa might correspond more closely with an example of a laksa now. Like, does it more closely correspond to laksa lemak or Peranakan laksa, Chinese laksa? So I'm trying to. So hence the pursuit
of that
into the record of the earliest recipes possible.
So the Singapore, what is known as Singapore laksa, and she refers to it as Singapore laksa as well, has a wonderful conglomeration of techniques which don't appear in any of the other laksas. So the grinding of spices, which is done in India, Malaysia, Indonesia, is very much part of this. But then, and as is coconut milk. But then the order of putting things in is very Chinese, and the way of cooking is Chinese. So it's just a very, for me, it's Singapore. It brings everyone and everything together to form its own national identity. So that really was the reason for choosing laksa, because it sort of
and also it's also one of those things that in some ways it's polyglot, right? It cannot be entirely claimed that way.
It can't be entirely claimed, and also you can't ever make it wrong, because
there's so many.
You can tweak it to whatever you want to bring to it. That's what I thought was
what we thought was also possibly in the name, in the etymology of laksa, right? The idea that lak is 1,000.
1,000.
Yeah, 1,000 different ingredients, 1,000 different ways to make it. I think the other interest I have is just to see if it reworks our idea of the kind of a national dish to trace these kind of more regional and sub-regional connections. I was really intrigued by the connections to Goa, how far the the curry leaf has traveled as a traded commodity and only to return again to this region and not making past certain distances.
You were also
in the trade
interested in the
networks.
economy of food, right?
Yeah.
And the economy of growing certain things,
Yeah.
or farming certain.
Yeah, and I'm also interested then in how these kinds of processes help develop kind of shared notions of how to cultivate land that that might provide another way of thinking about a shared history with how we approach the environment and nature. Yeah.
So Singapore specifically, you were also interested in seeing how things were grown here before we've now been built over.
Yeah, a little bit. Just I'm interested in how whether or not I know that there's been a number of kind of very clear plantation commodities. You know, we've had even for a while the pineapple. We've had rubber. We've had different fruits. We've had nutmeg. We just discovered chinconi.
Yeah, Cinchona.
Cinchona. So I'm curious whether or not any of the other edibles that we're familiar with in laksa ever made it into that profile, you know, of what could potentially be.
See, I think laksa is the absolute opposite of that profile.
I think so too. I have a feeling that
it is the everyday that is
everyday. It's
put
popular
together in such a way that the everyday transcends the everyday to become something quite delicious.
Yeah.
Whereas cinnamon and nutmeg were put into foods to make them special because they were so expensive.
Right.
You used very little of it, and that kind of made it.
That's
something.
True. I also wonder if it's because these were already food commodities that were prized in the established centers of trade in like London or elsewhere along the trading network established by empire. So therefore, the everyday becomes something that sits under that.
There is that,
and then flourished under that as well.
One of the things I was listening to today very strangely talked to this point, not about nutmeg and cinnamon, but about how the colonial project, in many ways during Victorian period especially, was about introducing food and food substances and trying to develop markets in UK or in Holland for things that were growing and were not necessarily expensive where they were grown, but because they were brought in, they became this luxury item. And a lot of the China trade in ceramics developed because of beautiful packaging for these amazing things, which gave it the whole notion of being from the Orient, and therefore the company was able to charge a lot more for the product. So it was in a way making a market, not that the substance itself was very expensive, like saffron has always been expensive.
It's true.
But you know, pepper, which grew in India, or cinnamon, which grew in Sri Lanka, was not locally expensive, but it was made into this brand that was considered luxury.
And I think that that might connect us to the history of tea, right? Where tea isn't it's not an expensive ingredient, but then it was actively traded and actively cultivated. And
more people got hooked onto it than they expected, and therefore it changed the balance of payments, and therefore the opium wars and everything else. So, but it's, you know, I was looking at Finnish recipe books for some reason, and for them, for Christmas, they always use cinnamon and nutmeg. Oh, and this is not a local thing, and yet it becomes part of tradition.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing, I'm hoping that from this we can find other inputs around specific ingredients that we're still
absolutely. I mean,
like especially around the different kinds of fish,
and also the Peranakan spices like candle nuts.
Candle nut, horse herring. We spoke a little bit about how salmon got into this idea we think of it now, especially from Southeast Asia, as integral to Japanese sushi, but it's really not.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating story anyway. I mean, it's just amazing.
Yeah. Are there things that you would want out of the next phase of this project? If there's things that you want to hear specifically about?
I mean, it would be great to be able to have some way of being able to differentiate and house these in their original places and cultures, and to see how they came about into this conglomeration that we now call laksa, so much so that someone can write a whole cookbook about laksa.
Yeah, I would want to see. I mean, if there's someone down there in the colonial office who has some amazing recipe, from the 1800s, please ring us up.
But also, the Chinese grandmothers with Hokkien memory.
Totally.
Yeah, because I think
bet.
that there must be that memory there of why and when, and was it seasonal, was it all through the year? I mean, none of the records give me that notion of when it was eaten, why it was eaten, and how important it was. And so I'd love to hear about that. And I just want grandmothers with memories to come forward with this.
I mean, you brought up such an interesting point. There's a current project to uncover and document the literatures of different kinds. It could just be like official records, but also novel stories and so on, that were written in Chinese script, but they were to be read as Hokkien.
Oh.
So they have apparently about 5 to 15% of the script that is the Chinese script cannot sonically it sonically doesn't record.
Oh, okay.
So they are only approximations of Hokkien words. So then sometimes they
because of the intonation and
so they create new. So there are kind of ideograms that would represent Hokkien words that are specific then to Hokkien. So I'm like, so that's also fascination. I'm only just encountering that material.
And also, I'd love to know if there is any Chinese origin in mainland China that uses these things.
Yeah, which is where we were tracking how far curry leaves were traded towards the east. I mean, past Singapore, Hong Kong. If you made it anywhere.
So, is there anything that you know that has this sort of noodle and conglomeration of spices? I mean, it wouldn't be northern China, I assume.
No, I wouldn't think so. But I'm also curious if like the curry or some variant of it made it into. So there are hot and sour dishes.
Yeah.
Spicy and sour. So that
like
kind of
the hot and sour soup and.
So I'm wondering also about that, the kind of cross influence.
Yeah, any form of kind of being able to tease out original patterns would be great. I think that oral histories have a huge part to play in this project.